So we begin Maseches Zevachim Beis Hashem with the Mishnah here at the beginning, and the Mishnah is going to address a concept called Shinui Kodesh, which means during one of the four avodos, there are four avodos. There's Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika. Right? There's Shchita, Kabbalah Hadam in a Mizrach, Holacha Hadam. The dam is brought to the Mizbeach, and then you do Zrika of the dam on the Mizbeach. If in any of those four avodos, the Kohen HaOved had what's called Machsheves Shinui Kodesh, meaning the animal was consecrated as an Olah, and he had, I'm going to say in mind, although that's a gigantic machlokas Rishonim, l'shem Shlomim. So it was an Olah, and he implemented any of the avodas for the purpose of Shlomim. Again, the question is whether or not the Kohen is guilty here, and we'll have to compensate the Baal HaKorban, because as soon we'll see that the Baal HaKorban in the case of Shini Kodesh has to bring a substitute Korban, and he has not fulfilled his neder with the first Korban. And then, in addition to Shinui Kodesh, just by way of introduction, we have something called Shinui Bailim, where the Kohen HaOved in one of the four avodos had in mind the wrong Bailim. Instead of, for example, Shchita L'Shem Ruvain, he did Shchita L'Shem Shimon. Now, let me just mention this gigantic controversy that I hinted about. And we'll call it a machlokas between Rashi, although most Rishonim agree with Rashi, so it's not just Rashi, and the Rambam. The Rambam understood that machsheves shinui, whether it's shinui bailim, shinui kodesh, is just machshava. It is what it is. The Kohen admits that he had the wrong machshava. Maybe we can't read his mind. Rashi, on the other hand, says, no, it's not enough that he thought the wrong thoughts. That doesn't register. That doesn't have any impact. It's dibur. He has to make a statement, this is for the purpose of Shlomim, when it's really an Olah. This is for the purpose of Shimon, when it's really when the real owner of the Korban is Ruvain. So you need dibur. The Mishnah says the following, Kol hazvachim shenizbechu shelo lishmon. So let's say, for example, you shechted a Korban Olah l'shem Shlomim. So that's called Shinui Kodesh. Ksherim. The Korban itself is kosher. What's lacking as a result of Machsheves Shinui Kodesh is what's called Ritzui Korban. Ritzui, which is a key word in all of Kodshim, refers to the power of the Korban to effectuate kapara. So this Korban, because of the boo-boo of Shinui Kodesh, could not effectuate a kapara, a ritzui. And therefore, even though the Korban is kosher, that means we're going to go through all the avodos, but nevertheless, now leave out the word Ella, because that's going to be a problem. Make believe it doesn't have the word Ella. And it should read Shelo Olu Lebailim L'Shem Chov, which means that if the Bailim took what's called a Nidava, they said, Harei Alai, I take upon myself to bring a Korban Olah. Olah is something that lends itself to a Korban Nidava. So he took a Nidava that he would bring a Korban Olah. This Korban, because of the Shinui Kodesh, will not fulfill his Nidava, which is a neder. He has not fulfilled his obligation that he accepted upon himself. He's going to have to replace this Korban and bring another one, which hopefully will be shechted, etc., properly, l'shem Olah, and it will replace the original Olah, and then he'll achieve the Ritzui Korban, he'll fulfill his neder, Motzav Sasecha Tishmar, and everything is fine. But this first Korban that was subject to Shinui kodesh will not be ola lebailim l'shem chova. It cannot fulfill his obligation. Now, let's just take one more moment for a very important introduction, and that's the difference between a neder and an nedava. Now, even a nedava is really a neder, but there's a fundamental difference between a neder and a nedava. What did he declare? Did he say harei olai, or did he say harei zu? In the case of a neder, and it's very easy to remember this if you remember that neder is a more generic term, all inclusive. In the case of a neder, he said harei olai. He didn't point to a specific animal. But in the case of a nedava, which is much more specific, he said harei zu. Now, if he says harei zu, and here's the nafkamina between a neder and a nedava, in a nedava, if this carbon is not ol l'shem chova, and it became pasul, or in this case, shinui kodesh means it's not ol l'shem chova, then he's off the hook. Because all he did was point to this animal and say harei zu. That's called a nedava. But if he took a more generic neder and he said harei olai, then he has not yet fulfilled his self-imposed obligation until he finally brings the right carbon in his kosher, and all the avodas were done lishma l'shem ola in this case. However, the Mishnah goes on to formulate exceptions to the rule. There are certain karbanos, like Karban Pesach and Chatos, where even if you had a Shinui Kodesh, the carbon is completely possible. Chutz min ha-Pesach va-Chatos. So let's say the Shechita was done not l'shem Pesach or not l'shem Chatos, everything freezes. Nothing will continue. We will not be molech the dam, we will not be zorik the dam. It's gone. It's possible. Now the Mishnah wants to know, what about the reverse? What happens if you have a carbon, let's say a shlomim or an ola, and you shecht it l'shem Pesach, or you shecht it l'shem Chatos? So the easier case, because it knows no exceptions, is where you shechted a carbon l'shem Chatos. It was not a Chatos, it was an ola, it was a shlomim, and you shechted it l'shem Chatos. Carbon is gone. History. Totally possible. It's not like the case of Ola l'shem shlomim, where you will go through all the avodas and finish the avoda, but rather it's possible. It's what you call psuli hamukdashim. Now, what happens if you shechted an animal l'shem pesach? So here the Mishnah stipulates a condition. When is the carbon possible? If and when bismana. Now, Bismano could be understood in two ways. It's either the morning of the 14th of Nisan, or more likely, according to most Rishonim, it's the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach. That's when we did the Avodah of the Carbon Pesach. And here he's got a Carbon Pesach right in front of him. And the time is right. It's the 14th of Nisan in the afternoon, and he shechted it for the sake of another Carbon. Possible. What would be if he shechted it, let's say a week before Pesach, right? So the Bailam designated as a Carbon Pesach a week before Pesach, which is fine. Now, they did the shechita or any of the avodos, l'shem olo, l'shem shlomim, whatever it might be, but it was shalom b'zmana. And in such a case, it becomes shlomim. And here, we'd have to go back to Masechta Psachim and understand the relationship, very close relationship between Carbon Pesach and Shlom. Now, where does Asham fit in? Until now, we've been talking about Ola, we've been talking about Shlomim, we've been talking about Chatos, we spoke about Pesach. What about a Carbon Asham? Now, logically, as we'll soon see in Rabbi Eliezer, Asham belongs like horse and carriage with Chatos. And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Af ha'asham, even in the case of a Carbon Asham, if he shechted it with a Shinui Kodesh, l'shem Ola, L'Shem, Shlomim, whatever it might be, then it's completely possible. Just like we said about chatos, without any exception, if you shechted whatever carbon, any category, l'shem chatos, it's possible. So too, if you shechted any carbon l'shem osham. Why? Because, and I'm going to skip a little bit and come right back, Omer Abelazar, because hachatas ba al hachet and ha'osham ba lachet. Ma chatas psula shelo lishma, af osham pasul shelo lishma. So Rabbi Eliezer has a complete comparison, an equation between chatos and osha because they're both baal achet. Ola is not necessarily baal achet, although, again, this is more sophisticated, but an ola could be mechaper on mitzvahs aseh. For example, he didn't sit in the sukkah, he didn't take the lulav, he brings a carbon ola. But fundamentally, essentially, carbon ola is something that you accept upon yourself. You want to get to closer to Hashem. And it's not a carbon that essentially is Baal Achit. Shlomim for sure is not Baal Achit. Carbon Pesach for sure is not Baal Achit. Let's just retrace our steps. And Rabbi Eliezer says the following. Ha-Pesach bizmano v'achatos v'osham b'chol zman. Now this statement looks like it's a continuation of Rabbi Eliezer's presentation, but really it's a stama meaning it is universally accepted by all Tanoim, that if you shechted or did any of the avodos of a carbon Pesach on the 14th of Nisan in the afternoon, l'shem, right, any carbon, and you shechted l'shem Pesach, and it's the 14th of the afternoon bismano, it's possible, completely possible. In the case of chatas v'osham, okay, so here it's Rabbi Eliezer speaking, then any carbon that was shechted at any time during the year for the sake of osham or chatas, and it's not an osham, it's not a chatas, it's possible. And now we get to Yossi ben Chon. What happens if you shechted any carbon on the 14th of Nisan, and it's not a carbon Pesach, and you shechted it l'shem Pesach? So we said the following, that in such a case, the Shinui Kodesh passes the carbon. So Yossi ben Choni reiterates that principle, and he says, with regard to all karbanos, hanishchativ, that they were shechted on the 14th of Nisan, l'shem Pesach, it was not a carbon Pesach, or any time during the year, you shechted any carbon that's not a chatos l'shem chatos, psulim. Now, what does that mean? He means to imply that if he shechted for the purpose of any other carbon other than Pesach, Bismano, or Chatas the whole year round, it would be kosher. But if it was shechted for the purpose of a Pesach and for a Chatos, and again, Pesach would be Bisman on the 14th, is then it's possible. So basically, again, we're anticipating what's going to come about a week and a half down the line. Rabbi Yossi ben Choni is sort of reiterating the basic principles here and pointing out the distinction of a shchita l'shem Pesach bisman, or a shchita l'shem chatas, as opposed to a shchita l'shem all the Zevachim. And the Gemara is going to say that Yossi ben Choni had sources the basis of which he proved his halach. Now the Mishnah goes on to introduce Shimon Achi Azariah. Now, normally, a chacham is called by the name of his father, Shimon ben so-and-so. Here, they gave cover to his brother, Azariah, because the Gemara tells us that Azariah and Shimon, two brothers, had an arrangement in which Shimon would dedicate himself exclusively to the study of Torah. Azariah would support him. And they made a split with the schar that Azariah, because he supported Shimon, would get part of the schar of his Torah. Shchatan l'shem gavoa mehen sherin. L'shem psulim, l'shem nanoch mehen psulim. Okay. Now at this point we introduce the fundamental distinction in Kodshim between what's called Kodshe Kodshim and Kodshim Kalam. When Shimon Achi Azariah refers to L'shem gavoa mihem, he meant that he had a korban shlomim, for example, which is Kodshim Kalim, and he shechted it L'shem Ola, which is Kodshe Kodshim. The reverse would be Ola L'shem Shlomim. Now, we already mentioned that Ola L'shem Shlomim is, the korban is kosher, but Eino Ola L'shem L'bailim L'shem Chova. But according to Shimon Achi Azariah, that Shlomim L'shem Ola, that Ola L'shem Shlomim is called L'namuch Shebahen. And why is it L'namuch Shebahen? Because he is downgrading the Kedusha from Kedushas Ola, which is Kodesh Kodashim, to Kedushas Shlomim, which is Kodshim Kalim. Therefore, the korban is absolutely possible. So that Ola L'shem Shlomim, according to Shimon, is possible. According to Tanakama, Ola L'shem Shlomim is Shinui Kodesh, and it's kosher. However, Shimon wants to say something beyond that, and let's say you shechted it L'gavoa Shalahem. So you had a Shlomim, and you shechted it L'shem Ola. Ola is Kodesh Kodashim. So you are upgrading rather than downgrading. Says Shimon Achi Azariah, in such a case, the korban is kosher. The Gemara later on is going to vacillate back and forth. What did Shimon mean when he said the korban is kosher in the case where it goes up from Shlomim L'shem Ola? Did he mean that it's Ola L'shem L'bailim L'shem Chova? It's a full-fledged kapara and ritzui? Or did he know it's kosher? We'll do all the avodos, but the owner of the korban, who owns a shlomim, will have to replace that korban. Ketzad. Kodshim kol sheshachtim l'shem kodshim kal psulim. Kodshim kal sheshachtim l'shem kodshim kodashim ksherim. V'chein, we go on. Habechor v'hamaseh sheshchatan l'shem shlomim. Shlomim has a higher kedusha than Bechor and Maser. Maser we spoke about just earlier at the end of Masechta Chorios with the Mishnah Bechoros that we learned. And the difference between, again, I'll say Maser, but again, Bechor and Maser are equal. They have the same status. The difference between Maser and Shlomim is in the following. Okay, I'm just looking for the list. Number one, Smicha, just a second. And then there's what's called Zroy L'chayim V'Keva. Just one second. I just want to get the list, sorry. Matan Domin. When the dam is sprinkled on the Mizbeach, there are four corners to the Mizbeach. And in the case of Shlomim, you need a matanos means the zrikos of the dam on all four corners. In the case of Bechar and Maser, on the other hand, matana achas, just do a zrika on any one of the four corners. Shlomim needs smicha. There's no smicha by Maser or Bechar. Shlomim requires tnufas, chaza, v'shok. Bechar and Maser do not have those mitzvahs. So the bottom line is that the kedusha of Shlomim is greater than that of Bechar and Maser, and therefore, if you shechted a Bechar or a Maser behema l'shem Shlomim, then share it, because as we saw, that's called upgrading, milamata lamala. But in the reverse case, you had Shlomim, which is a greater kedusha than Bechar or Maser, and you shechted it l'shem Bechar or Maser, then the carbon is possible. The Gemara says the following: Lama li lemisnei ella shelo olu. The word ella in the Mishnah is totally superfluous. Drop it, listening. It should have said v'lo olu l'bayim l'shem chava. What's ella? And the Gemara says that ella is coming to tell you that the carbon really is fine. It's a carbon kosher. Ella, the only problem is that the Bailim, if they took a neder, would have to replace it. It still retains its kedusha. The asur l'shnuye bahu. Right, there's an isur lav in the Torah not to be meshana from one carbon to the other. That's called shini kodesh, and the isur of shini kodesh will apply to the holacha and zrika, even though he already shechted it shalol lishma with a shini kodesh. And that's called in the Lashon Hashas b'kedushasei kaimei. It still remains and retains its kedusha asur l'shnuyei bei. There's a whole issue here exactly what violation he's guilty of. There's a lot of Torah on this. Maybe I'll just mention in passing. Again, this is way beyond our... According to the Brisker Rav in the Rambam, he claims that already with the shechita, there was a chalos carbon puzzle through the Shini Kodesh. So what does it mean that it says v'asur l'shnuyei bei? He holds that this has nothing to do with the carbon itself, meaning the carbon itself is possible because of the Shini Kodesh, but rather it's a separate isur. That when you violate an isur, you should not do the same isur again and again and again. There was an isur on the first round when he shechted shalol lishma, and now to again do the zrika shalol lishma, that we won't tolerate. Kida Rava, like Rava says, ola sheshchata shalol lishma, so he shechted the ola l'shem shlomim, asur lizrok as dama shalol lishma. Even though the carbon is possible, nevertheless, there's an isur, we'll call it an isur gavra, it's not inherent in the carbon, to go ahead and do the zrika shalol lishma. Ibay seima, if we want to know the source for Rava's conclusion that you're not allowed to do the zrika shalol lishma once, even though you already did the shchita shalol lishma, Ibay seima sfar, maybe it's logical. Ibay seima kra, maybe we derive from a pasuk. Ibay seima svara, Mishum deshani be kol hani deshnuyi be v'lezil, because he messed up once and he changed the lishma of the carbon. Now we're going to say let him do it again and again. It's like somebody who, he ate some poisonous food. Now we're going to tell him to eat more poisonous food. Ibay seima kra, or we can alternatively explain Rava through a pasuk. Motzav chasecha tishmar v'asisu kasher adat Hashem Elokecha Elokecha. Whenever you designate it as a carbon, an animal as a carbon, then you accept upon yourself a chiyuv, which is a neder, and you say harei alai carbon, and that's a neder. And the Torah says motzav chasecha tishmar, you have to fulfill your neder. Now, that's only kasher nadarta, because he took a neder. But strangely enough, the pasuk ends with the words nidava. I mean, what's going on? Are we talking about a neder? Or are we talking about a nidava? I mean, a nidava is when he says harezu, and if it gets lost or it dies or it becomes possible, he doesn't have to replace it. He has no achrayas. He said harezu. So therefore, hi nidava. How could the pasuk call it a nidava? Nederhu.